Thomas Willard had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for nearly 20 years, long before it became the pristine subdivision it was today. His 3-acre property sat at the edge of the development, featuring a natural creek that meandered through the back portion of his land. The creek had been one of the main reasons he purchased the property in the first place. Over the years, he cultivated the area around it, planting native species and creating a small wildlife sanctuary that attracted herons, frogs, and the occasional family of ducks. When the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association formed 5 years ago after the neighborhood expanded, Thomas had reluctantly joined, seeing it as a necessary compromise to maintain neighborhood harmony. Initially, the HOA had focused on reasonable community concerns, standardizing mailboxes, organizing block parties, and ensuring garbage bins weren't left at the curb for days. Thomas even served on the landscaping committee for a year, helping select drought-resistant plants for the community entrance. But everything changed when Eleanor Jenkins became HOA president. A retired school administrator with too much time on her hands, Eleanor approached community management with the same rigid authority she'd wielded over middle schoolers for 30 years. Under her leadership, the HOA rules had expanded from a reasonable 5-page document to a 30-page manifesto covering everything from acceptable shades of beige for exterior paint to the maximum height of garden gnomes. Thomas had managed to fly under Eleanor's radar, until now. Every Sunday morning, weather permitting, Thomas followed the same routine. He'd wake at dawn, brew a pot of strong coffee, and spend the early hours tending to his creek sanctuary. Today was no different as he carefully pruned the native honeysuckle that bordered the water's edge, the sweet scent mingling with the earthy aroma of wet soil and moss. The creek itself wasn't impressive by conventional standards, just 6 to 8 feet wide, and shallow enough to wade across in most spots. But to Thomas, it was a masterpiece of nature's engineering. It meandered in gentle curves across his property, creating small pools where dragonflies skimmed the surface and minnows darted between water plants he'd carefully selected for filtration and habitat. "Morning, Tom," called a voice from over the natural fence of viburnums that separated his property from the walking trail that wound through the development. Mike Chen, his next-door neighbor and one of the few original homeowners left besides Thomas, approached with his golden retriever in tow. "Brought you something," Mike said, handing Thomas a manila envelope. "Minutes from the last HOA meeting. Thought you might want to see what they're up to now." Thomas sighed, setting down his pruning shears. "Do I even want to know?" "Probably not, but better informed than blindsided," Mike replied, his normally cheerful expression somber. "Eleanor's faction is pushing through amendments to the water feature regulations, claiming safety concerns." Thomas frowned, glancing at his beloved creek. "This is barely a water feature. It's a natural waterway that was here before any of these houses." "I know that, and you know that," Mike said, "but Eleanor's been making noise about liability ever since the Johnsons' grandkids were playing near it last month. You know how she gets when she fixates on something." Thomas nodded, a sense of unease settling in his stomach as he watched a green heron land silently on a half-submerged log, its reflection perfect in the still water of a pool. The sanctuary he'd spent 2 decades nurturing suddenly felt fragile, threatened by bureaucracy and arbitrary rules created by people who saw nature as something to be controlled rather than preserved. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Thomas heard the knock at his door. Opening it, he found Eleanor flanked by 2 other HOA board members, all wearing expressions that suggested they were preparing to deliver bad news. "Mr. Willard," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the practiced tone of authority she perfected over decades. "The board has received complaints about the creek on your property. We've determined it presents a significant safety hazard for neighborhood children." Thomas blinked in confusion. "The creek? It's barely 2 feet deep at its deepest point, and it's on my private property." Eleanor handed him an official-looking letter. "According to Bylaw 17.3, added last month, all water features must be properly secured with fencing or filled in. Your creek has been deemed non-compliant. This is ridiculous. Thomas argued. The creek was here long before the HOA. It's a natural waterway, not a swimming pool. Nevertheless, Eleanor continued, unmoved, the board has voted. You have 30 days to either install appropriate fencing, which must be approved by the architectural committee, or drain the creek. Failure to comply will result in fines of $100 per day. As they turned to leave, Eleanor added with feigned sympathy, think of the children, Mr. Willard. We wouldn't want a tragedy on our hands. Thomas stood in his doorway, letter in hand, watching them retreat to Eleanor's immaculately maintained Tudor-style home across the street. A slow, simmering anger began to build within him. He closed the door with more force than necessary, the sound echoing through his otherwise quiet home. The coffee he'd been enjoying just minutes earlier now sat cold and forgotten on the kitchen counter as he spread the HOA letter on the table, scanning the dense legal language that effectively condemned his creek. Thomas reached for his phone, punching in Mike's number. His neighbor answered on the second ring. They came, Thomas said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled fury. Eleanor and her minions. They're saying the creek is a safety hazard. Damn, that was fast, Mike replied. I only gave you those meeting minutes yesterday. Thomas pinched the bridge of his nose. There's a new bylaw. 17.3. Did you know about this? It was buried in the addendum, Mike admitted. They pushed it through during the new business section, when half the homeowners had already left. Classic Eleanor move. Thomas grabbed his jacket and keys. I need to see this for myself. Meeting at your place in 5. 20 minutes later, Thomas and Mike stood at the edge of the creek, analyzing the situation. Thomas had brought the letter, which included specifics about the required fencing. 6 feet high, matching the community's approved styles, with self-closing gates and child-proof locks. The fencing alone would cost thousands, Thomas calculated, not to mention it would destroy the entire ecosystem. Animals couldn't access the water, the native plants would be damaged during installation. And that's exactly what Eleanor wants, Mike said grimly. She knows you won't fence it, so you'll be forced to drain it. But why? Thomas asked, watching a pair of cardinals splash in the shallow water. What does she gain from this? Mike hesitated. You haven't heard the rumors. Eleanor's son-in-law just started a landscaping company. Word is, he's looking to expand into water features, the kind that are HOA approved. Thomas's expression darkened as the pieces clicked into place. He remembered seeing Eleanor's daughter and her husband at the last community barbecue, how they distributed business cards and talked about reimagining outdoor spaces. So this isn't about safety at all, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. It's about eliminating the competition, natural waterways that make their artificial ponds look like the overpriced puddles they are. Despite Thomas's protests, appeals, and even hiring a lawyer who specialized in property rights, the HOA remained unmoved. His lawyer explained that while the HOA's demands were unreasonable, the recent bylaw addition did technically give them authority, and fighting it would be costly and time-consuming. On day 29 of his grace period, Thomas watched in helpless fury as a contractor hired by the HOA arrived with heavy equipment. The creek, his sanctuary for 2 decades, was systematically destroyed. The contractor diverted the water, filled in the natural bed with dirt and gravel, and compacted it until no trace of the flowing water remained. That evening, Thomas sat on his back porch, staring at the ugly scar where his beautiful creek had once flowed. The silence was deafening. No more gentle babbling of water, no frogs calling at dusk. The wildlife that had made this small ecosystem their home had vanished. As he nursed a glass of bourbon, Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor and fellow HOA skeptic, Mike Chen. Heard what they did. That's beyond wrong. Let me know if you want to fight back. I've got ideas. Thomas typed back a simple response. I'm listening. The morning after the destruction, Thomas woke before dawn, his sleep having been fitful and plagued by dreams of bulldozers crushing the delicate ecosystem he'd spent decades nurturing. He made his usual pot of coffee out of habit, but when he stepped onto his back porch, the wrongness of the scene hit him all over again. Where once the gentle sound of flowing water had greeted him, there was now only silence. The vibrant green corridor that had cut through his property was replaced by a strip of raw, exposed earth, crushed, compacted, and utterly lifeless. Even the air felt different. The subtle humidity that had always hung around the creek now gone, leaving everything feeling parched and abandoned. Thomas walked the length of what had been his creek, his boots leaving imprints in the loose soil. He knelt and picked up a handful of dirt, letting it sift through his fingers. As he did, he noticed something protruding from the ground, a small turtle shell, cracked and empty. The sight of it made his throat tighten. How many creatures had been displaced or worse? The sound of an expensive car engine drew his attention to the street. Eleanor Jenkins drove by slowly in her silver Mercedes, deliberately slowing to a crawl as she passed Thomas's driveway. When she caught his eye, she offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes before accelerating away. Inside, Thomas spread out the papers his lawyer had provided. The man had been sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. HOAs have broad authority when it comes to community standards and safety, he had explained. You could challenge it in court, but it would likely take years and tens of thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of success. What the lawyer had mentioned almost as an afterthought, however, was what now caught Thomas's attention. If you're really determined, the lawyer had said, you might look into environmental regulations. Those supersede HOA authority in many cases. Thomas had been too distracted by the imminent destruction to pursue that angle, but now, with nothing left to lose, he began researching in earnest. He started with county regulations, then state environmental protection laws, and finally federal wetland preservation statutes. By afternoon, he'd accumulated a stack of potentially relevant information, but he wasn't an environmental lawyer. He needed expertise, and he needed a strategy. That's when Mike's text arrived, offering precisely what Thomas needed most, a path forward. As Thomas typed his response, "I'm listening," he felt something shift inside him. The despair that had weighed him down all day began to transform into something more potent, more focused. Eleanor Jenkins and her HOA cronies had won this battle, but Thomas was beginning to see that the war was far from over. Thomas hadn't become a successful civil engineer by acting impulsively. For the next 2 weeks, he meticulously researched local water rights, environmental regulations, and the geological history of Oak Ridge estates. What he discovered would have made Eleanor's perfectly highlighted hair stand on end. The development sat on what had once been wetlands. Before construction began 25 years ago, the developer had obtained permits to redirect water and build on part of the natural marshland. But those permits came with specific conditions that Thomas suspected weren't being properly maintained. More importantly, Thomas Creek hadn't simply been a picturesque water feature, it had been an essential part of the area's natural drainage system. The water that once flowed through it didn't simply disappear because the HOA had filled in his portion of the creek. It needed somewhere to go. With Mike's help, Thomas contacted an environmental consultant who specialized in wetland restoration. After reviewing Thomas's property and the surrounding area, the consultant confirmed what Thomas had suspected. By destroying the creek, the HOA had disrupted the natural water flow and potentially violated several environmental regulations. The water will find its way, the consultant explained. Nature always does, and with the heavy rain season coming up, well, those houses downhill from your property might find themselves with some unexpected moisture problems. Thomas thanked the consultant and paid his fee. For the first time since Eleanor and her cronies had appeared at his door, he smiled. That smile still lingered as Thomas spread the county land survey maps across his dining room table. Mike leaned over them, a cold beer in hand, as the environmental consultant, Dr. Amelia Reeves, pointed to various blue lines that crisscrossed the development. "See these?" she said, tracing her finger along what appeared to be a network of faint blue veins running beneath Oak Ridge Estates. These are the original water channels that existed before development. Your creek wasn't just any creek. It was part of a larger water system that's been here for thousands of years. Thomas nodded, his engineer's mind quickly grasping the implications. So the water from the hills has always flowed through my property on its way to the river. Exactly, Dr. Reeves confirmed. When the developer built Oak Ridge, they had to work around these natural waterways. That's why your lot is larger. They couldn't build houses on a natural drainage path. Mike pointed to a cluster of houses downhill from Thomas's property. And these homes, including Eleanor's, they are all built where water would naturally flow if not for the creek channeling it safely away. Precisely, Dr. Reeves smiled, her expression both professional and mischievous. The original development plans included specific drainage requirements to compensate for building in these areas. I've reviewed the permits, and they required maintenance of all natural waterways, including your creek. Thomas leaned back, processing this information. So when the HOA destroyed my creek, they actually violated the original development permits. Dr. Reeves nodded, pulling out a thick folder of legal documents. These are copies of the environmental impact studies and conditional permits granted to the original developer. Note Section 7B, which explicitly prohibits alteration, filling, or obstruction of existing natural drainage channels. Thomas's training as an engineer helped him understand exactly what would happen next. The water from the hills would still come, whether the creek existed or not. But now, instead of following its channeled path through his property, it would spread out, seeking the path of least resistance, directly toward the homes built in what had once been a natural drainage basin. I need to protect myself legally, Thomas said thoughtfully. If I understand correctly, I could be held liable if I deliberately redirect water toward other properties. Dr. Reeves smiled. That's the beauty of it, Mr. Willard. You don't need to redirect anything. You simply need to restore your land to its natural, environmentally protected state. The water will do what it has always done for centuries. Follow the path of least resistance. For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt a sense of control returning. The HOA had destroyed his creek, but in doing so, they had unwittingly set the stage for nature to reclaim what had always been hers. Thomas submitted a proposal to the County Environmental Office for a wetland restoration project on his property. His application meticulously documented the historical water patterns, the recent disruption, and the potential environmental benefits of restoring the natural flow. He emphasized the positive impact on local wildlife, water filtration, and flood prevention. The county, always eager to support environmental initiatives, especially those that cost them nothing, enthusiastically approved his proposal and even offered a small grant for native plantings. With permit in hand, Thomas began work immediately. But instead of simply recreating his creek, he expanded his vision. Following the consultant's recommendations, he created a series of small retention ponds and marshy areas across the back portion of his property, all perfectly legal and environmentally beneficial. He strategically positioned these new wetland features so that when it rained, the water would naturally collect and slowly seep into the ground, precisely in the direction of Eleanor Jenkins' immaculate tutor and the homes of the other board members who had voted to destroy his creek. When Eleanor stormed over to complain about his unsightly mud pits, Thomas calmly showed her his county-approved permits and the environmental award he'd received for his restoration efforts. "I'm just doing my part for the environment, Eleanor," he said with innocent sincerity. "Think of the wildlife." The transformation of Thomas' property began on a Monday morning in early spring. He'd hired Greenfield Ecological Services, a company with impeccable credentials, and importantly, no connections to Eleanor's son-in-law's landscaping business. Their trucks arrived at dawn, carrying native plants, organic materials, and specialized equipment designed for minimal environmental impact. Dr. Reeves supervised the project personally, walking the property with Thomas and the crew chief, marking areas for the retention ponds and marshy sections. "We want to mimic what nature would do if left to its own devices," she explained, her enthusiasm evident as she pointed out the natural contours of the land. The crew worked methodically, following the detailed plans Thomas and Dr. Reeves had developed. Instead of digging deep, artificial-looking ponds, they created shallow depressions of varying sizes that would hold water temporarily during rains before allowing it to slowly percolate into the ground. Around these depressions, they planted water-loving species native to the region: swamp milkweed, cardinal flower, blue flag iris, and several varieties of sedges and rushes. By Wednesday afternoon, curious neighbors had begun to gather at the edge of Thomas's property, watching the transformation with interest. Mike took it upon himself to explain the project, emphasizing the environmental benefits and the county's endorsement. "It's going to be a certified wildlife habitat," he told Mrs. Patterson from down the street. "Thomas got a grant from the county to bring back native species that used to be all over this area before the development was built." Eleanor, however, was not impressed. Thomas spotted her Mercedes parked across the street, its engine running while she watched through narrowed eyes. When she finally approached on Thursday morning, her face was flushed with barely contained anger. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Mr. Willard?" she demanded, gesturing at the work in progress. These swamps look absolutely terrible. This is a premium neighborhood, not a wildlife refuge." Thomas was prepared for this confrontation. He calmly retrieved a folder from his workbench and handed her several official-looking documents. "These are the county-approved permits for a wetland restoration project," he explained, his voice level and professional. "And this is a letter from the State Environmental Protection Agency commending the initiative. They're sending a representative next week to consider it for their model habitat program." Eleanor scanned the documents, her frown deepening. "This can't possibly comply with HOA regulations." "Actually," Thomas replied, "Section 14.2 of the HOA bylaws specifically states that landscaping that meets county environmental certification is exempt from standard appearance guidelines." He pulled out a highlighted copy of the HOA's own rules. "You might recall voting for that amendment yourself last year when your son-in-law wanted to install those eco-friendly concrete water features." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor, whose face shifted between shades of red and white. "The board will hear about this," she finally managed, thrusting the documents back at Thomas. "I certainly hope so," Thomas replied with a smile. "In fact, I've been invited to present the project at the state's Environmental Conservation Symposium next month. I'd be happy to acknowledge the HOA's contribution to making this possible." As Eleanor stormed back to her car, Thomas returned to planting a cluster of blue lobelia at the edge of what would soon be a thriving wetland ecosystem, positioned precisely where the natural water flow would direct excess moisture toward Eleanor's meticulously landscaped backyard. The autumn rains came early and hard that year. For days, water poured from the sky, saturating the ground and filling Thomas's newly created wetland system to capacity. As he had anticipated, the water slowly percolated through the soil, following the natural downhill flow that had existed long before Oak Ridge Estates was built. Within a week, the problems began. Eleanor noticed it first, a persistent dampness in her basement that quickly evolved into standing water. Soon, other HOA board members reported similar issues: soggy lawns that wouldn't dry, foundation cracks, mold problems, and the unmistakable smell of stagnant water. The HOA called an emergency meeting, which Thomas attended with carefully concealed satisfaction. Eleanor, her perfect hair now somewhat frazzled, demanded that something be done about the water situation. "The county hydrologist says it's the natural water table," Thomas informed the group, feigning concern. "Apparently, when you disrupt natural water flows, the water finds new paths. Who could have predicted that?" The cost to install proper drainage systems for the affected homes was estimated at over $300,000, far exceeding the HOA's reserve fund. Special assessments would be necessary, with the largest portions naturally falling to those houses most affected, primarily the board members who had voted to destroy Thomas's Creek. In the final twist of irony, the county environmental office recommended that the best long-term solution would be to restore the natural creek bed that had existed for decades, the very one the HOA had destroyed. As Thomas walked home from the meeting, he paused to admire one of the small ponds he created. A great blue heron stood motionless at its edge, patiently waiting for dinner. In the distance, he could hear Eleanor arguing with a contractor about the cost of waterproofing her basement. Thomas smiled. Nature, as it turned out, was not only resilient. It had a sense of justice all its own. The emergency meeting had been held in the community center, a single-story building with windows that faced Eleanor's Tudor home. As the homeowners filed out into the rainy evening, many paused to watch the spectacle unfolding across the street. Emergency pumping services attempting to remove water from Eleanor's basement for the third time that week. Thomas stepped out into the soft, steady rain, opening his umbrella as Mike joined him on the sidewalk. "That went about as well as could be expected," Mike commented, nodding toward the cluster of HOA board members huddled under the building's awning, their expressions grim as they examined the drainage estimates. "I particularly enjoyed the moment when Eleanor suggested they could levy a special assessment on my property to pay for their drainage issues," Thomas replied. The county representative's face was priceless. Indeed, the county environmental protection officer who had attended the meeting had been unequivocal. Thomas's wetland restoration project was not only legal but exemplary. "Mr. Willard's property is functioning exactly as nature intended," she had explained to the increasingly frustrated board members. "The water problems you're experiencing are the direct result of disrupting the natural water system, specifically the creek that was filled in without proper environmental impact studies." As Thomas and Mike walked past Eleanor's house, they could see her son-in-law's landscaping truck parked in the driveway. A crew was frantically working to dig trenches around the foundation, their efforts largely futile in the saturated ground. "I hear his business is struggling," Mike mentioned casually. "Turns out installing artificial ponds doesn't qualify for the same tax incentives as actual environmental restoration work." Thomas nodded, feeling a twinge of satisfaction that wasn't entirely charitable. "The county inspector paid me another visit yesterday. They're considering using my property as a case study for suburban wetland restoration. There might even be additional grant money available." They continued down the street, passing several other homes with sump pumps running continuously, discharging streams of water that simply flowed back toward the same properties. Water always found the lowest point, in this case, the natural basin where several board members' homes had been built. The following week brought an unexpected letter to Thomas's mailbox, an official notice from the county planning department. They were reconsidering the original development permits for Oak Ridge Estates in light of recent hydrological events. Preliminary findings suggested that the original creek might need to be fully restored to its natural state to prevent ongoing flooding issues. The letter included a map with a proposed creek restoration path, cutting directly through Eleanor's immaculate backyard and those of two other board members. When Thomas met with Dr. Reeves to review the proposal, she couldn't suppress a smile. "You know, in all my years consulting on environmental restoration, I've never seen nature exact its revenge quite so perfectly," she admitted. "Those homes should never have been built where they are without maintaining the original water channels." Thomas watched a family of wood ducks splash down in one of his ponds, the ducklings trailing behind their mother in a perfect line. "Nature always finds a way," he said simply, echoing the words she had spoken to him months ago. By spring, Oak Ridge Estates had a new HOA president. Mike had been elected in a landslide after Eleanor resigned, citing personal reasons that everyone knew had more to do with her ongoing battle with mold remediation companies. The creek restoration project was underway, with funding from the county, state environmental grants, and yes, a special assessment on those properties that had initiated the original disruption of the natural waterway. Thomas volunteered to serve as a consultant on the restoration, offering his expertise as both an engineer and now, somewhat ironically, as Oak Ridge Estate's most celebrated environmental advocate. The local paper had even featured his wetland project in a special Earth Day edition, complete with photos of the thriving ecosystem he had created. As he stood at the edge of his property one evening, watching contractors break ground on the creek restoration that would once again allow water to flow naturally through the neighborhood, Thomas felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The wildlife had returned to his sanctuary: herons, frogs, dragonflies, and even a family of otters that had made one of his ponds their home. Eleanor's house, now sporting a prominent Ford SSALT sign, stood as a monument to the folly of those who believed they could control nature with bylaws and bulldozers. The realtor had been honest in the listing, noting the property's ongoing water management challenges and the new creek that would soon run through the backyard. Nature, Thomas reflected as he listened to the chorus of frogs greeting the evening, didn't care about property values or HOA regulations. It simply followed the path of least resistance, a lesson Eleanor Jenkins and her allies had learned the hard way.